All right, let's begin this next section on roots. We're going to take a look at the plant underground. Roots are quite often overlooked, but it's an important part of the plant growing system. They have a huge effect on plant size and vigor, adaptation to soil types, and response to cultural practices and irrigation if you're farming. The principal function of roots are to absorb nutrients and moisture, anchor the plant in the soil, and support the stem and to store food. That's probably a test question, by the way. Well, we like to call roots the hidden half, but it's not quite half. Early in the plant's life, there's generally more of a plant's biomass underground. Later in life, the above ground portion may be larger, depending on if the plant's an annual or a perennial. But roots make up about half of the plant. That's the half we don't see. And here are the functions again. Remember, that's a test question. There are two basic types of root systems. The carrot on the left represents a taproot, and what looks like an African violet to me represents a fibrous root system. The taproot has a single dominant primary root. It originates in the embryo of the seeds. In most dicots, it grows downward, giving rise to a few smaller lateral roots, which quite often you don't see. In that fibrous root system of monocots, the primary root system is short-lived, and the roots branch a lot. Fibrous root systems don't go as deep as taproots, but they spread out and hold the soil. They're really good as ground covers to prevent erosion for this reason. All of the root structures begin with the root apical meristem. Here cell division happens, cells divide and multiply and usually differentiate to become specialized tissues. Those specialized tissues are at the bottom, the root cap. These usually become dead cells, but they protect the meristematic, the growing region, from harm. The primary phloem is carrying sugars and nutrients throughout the plant, and the primary xylem is carrying water up to the shoots. Each of the root hairs that shoot out from the side increase the surface area of the root to increase water absorption and nutrient absorption as well. Looking more closely at the components of the root cap is made up of dead cells that decay and they produce a slimy kind of a gel that allows the plant to push the root down through the soil. The apical meristem cells are actually called omnipotent. That means they can become almost any kind of tissue depending on their location and how they develop. As they divide, they differentiate, becoming the specialized tissue up higher in the root. Roots will generally grow downward in response to gravity, but they'll also go looking for channels in the soil, finding moisture. They divide, they elongate, and they differentiate, and they become well established. As they become well established, the quantity and the distribution of the roots will influence the plant's ability to absorb moisture and nutrients. For most plants, the majority of the absorbing, the feeder roots, are located in the top 8 to 12 inches. Okay, there's three general regions of the root system. They're not sharply divided. They kind of integrate into each other, but they're general zones that you can see in the root system. The bottom one is a zone of cell division. The apical meristem divides and creates different kinds of cells behind it. Then the cells begin to elongate. Right behind the area of cell division, cells get longer and push the root cap down into the soil. Finally, there's a region of cell differentiation where cells can develop into different kinds of functional parts of the root system. Sorry about the misspelling there on zone of elongation. That's kind of a strange look, isn't it? If we go higher up in the root system, take a cross section of the root, you see three primary structures. The epidermis, the outside, usually composed of a single layer of cells closely packed together. The next region is the cortex, which occupies the greatest region of the primary root. Stores a lot of sugars and starch. This is what makes a sweet potato sweet. And then the vascular system consists of the tissues, the xylem, and the phloem that transport water and nutrients. We look more closely at the root epidermis. These are a single layer of cells on the outside of the plant root, and they actually begin to make root hairs. You can see the little tiny root hairs. Those are single cells. Each one of them is a delicate, elongated epidermal cell. It begins in a small region just behind the root's growing tip. Their function is to increase the root's surface area and absorptive capacity. Root hairs usually live 1 or 2 days, absorbing nutrients. The young seedling is transplanted. They're quite often torn off. They may dry out in the sun. That's why it's necessary to water young plants, young transplants, as soon as they're set outside. The cortex makes up the bulk of the root system, stores sugars and starches and water, and provides support for the plant root system. Here in this picture, you can see the sweet potato on the bottom left and the tropical yam, which is the whiter colored root, um, on the top right of the picture. They're all part of the root cortex. And the final area of differentiation are the vascular system, the so-called plumbing of the plant, the primary xylem, which carries water, and the primary phloem, which carries sugar. Let's take another look at the four functions of the roots, starting with anchorage. Anchorage is greatly enhanced by the branch roots, which form higher up on the root than the root hairs. Root hairs are doing a lot of work down below, doing water absorption and nutrient absorption. But higher up, you can get branch roots that can actually occur above the soil surface. Here's some branch roots on a corn plant. They're technically called adventitious roots because they adventure above the soil surface. You can find them in some place that you don't usually find roots. They're true roots. They're not stems, and you can tell because they don't produce chlorophyll. Roots never turn green. Stem tissue can turn green. See the adventitious roots on the screw pine tree? These are called long prop roots. They prop the plant up, but they're actually root systems, and you know they're roots because they won't turn green. If you scratch it a little bit to the surface and the sun hits it, it won't turn green like a stem would. Look at the adventitious roots of this banyan tree. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference just by looking at it, which is a root and which is a branch. You can clearly find out by just simply scratching the surface, waiting a couple of days. The branch will green up and the root will not. These prop roots or buttress roots are really important in areas where it's really wet. Wet soil will not hold the tree quite as well, and so having these extra buttress roots keeps the plant sturdy. Another way the roots are important to plants is absorption of minerals. The root hairs do most of the work absorbing water and nutrients, minerals. Bacteria growing on the dead cells around those root hairs can help make the soil more digestible. The bacteria kind of get fed by the sugars in the dying root system, and the root gets a slimy covering which helps them grow down through the soil. The bacteria in the plant are working together in this case. Here's another case where bacteria and roots work together. The nodules on this root system are actually um, caused by bacteria that infect the root system and cause the root to grow around it. This is a rhizobium bacteria living inside these nodules. And these rhizobia can actually take nitrogen out of the air that's around the root system and make it into a form of nitrogen the plants can use. This is a symbiotic relationship because both the bacteria and the plant benefit. The plant gets nitrogen from the rhizobium, and the rhizobium bacteria gets sugars from the plant. Here's another symbiotic relationship in which fungi are growing on the roots of the plant here. Fungi help break down the soil and create soluble nutrients for the plant to take up those nutrients. and the fungi get sugars out of the plant. You can see these two redwood seedlings. One was grown with fungi and one without. The fungi, called mycorrhizae in this case, help the plant grow faster. You can see the plant on the right, which has the mycorrhizae infecting it, is growing much faster because it can absorb more nutrients. And the third function of roots is absorption of water. Water is taken up by roots into the plant by a process called osmosis. This is the movement of water from a region of low concentration of a salt, like the soil, to a region of higher concentration of salt, such as inside the plant root. In this case, the water pushes into the plant root, moving from the soil into the plant root through osmosis. Osmosis, which is the movement of water from low salt concentration to higher concentration, is quite often confused with diffusion. Diffusion is movement of the salt across a membrane. In this case, water is doing the moving. This diagram depicts osmosis. In the top left picture here, the blue dots represent water and the red dots represent some kind of mineral salt. The second one off to the right, you can see the two containers have been connected, and the membrane between the two containers is one that allows water to flow through, but not allow salt to flow through. And what will happen is that water will move from the left container to the right container as it moves from a lower concentration of salt to a higher concentration of salt across this membrane. This is how osmosis works in the root system. Osmosis is one way in which water is absorbed into the plant root. This is called root pressure, as water moves from low concentration of salt in the soil to a higher concentration of salt in the plant root. Root pressure caused by osmosis is a relatively weak form of water movement in the plant. But here you can see in a small plant how water is moved up through the plant leaf, through the grass leaf, and is coming out the tip of the plant. This is caused by root pressure. Root pressure is generally too weak to move water up the stems of large plants like trees. Another force is needed, and that's called transpiration, which we'll look at now. Transpiration is the evaporation of water from the leaf surface. As water evaporates and leaves the leaf, it pulls more water up through the xylem, right through the stem. Root pressure is pushing, and evaporation or transpiration is pulling, and this push me, pull you kind of thing helps move water through the plant. And the fourth function of roots is storage. Carrots store sugars and carbohydrates so it can produce seeds and reproduce itself the following year. Humans kind of steal these carbohydrates when we harvest a carrot. Sweet potato is another example of an underground root system that's primarily used for storage. Both sweet potatoes and the true tropical yam are storage roots, when they're quite often confused. The tropical yam, the genus is called Dioscorea, and the sweet potato, the genus is Ipomea. You don't need to know that, but they're quite different plants. Uh, Often you'll find a sweet potato labeled in a grocery store as a yam. Marketers do that in order to charge you more money. Well, a sweet potato is a true root. The Irish or common potato is not a root system, but actually an underground stem. You can tell by when they turn green in the sunlight. Another well-used storage root is cassava. You can see these really large cassava roots. They need to be peeled before they're eaten because there's a toxin in the epidermis, but it's a huge storage root. Another useful root is horseradish. If you like horseradish, just get a piece of a live root and stick it in the soil. It'll grow. It grows like a weed. In southern Illinois, there's where a lot of horseradish is grown. They actually have a horseradish festival every year. The mandrake is another underground storage root. It's claimed that when the mandrake is pulled from the soil, it screams. Remember that scene from the Harry Potter movie? Roots can be amazingly beautiful. All right, let's move on to stems. The stem at the top left is a potato. The Irish potato or the common potato is actually a stem, not a root system. The kohlrabi in the bottom left is another stem. It's a swollen stem. And of course, the trunk of a tree is a stem. Here's another test question. Let's look at the function of stems. Stems can store sugars in the above ground portion, like the potato or the trunk of a tree. It supports the leaves and roots and conducts water and sugars throughout the plant. The stem or the shoot initiates in the embryo of the seed. As it begins to elongate, it differentiates into nodes and internodes. The nodes are the areas where new leaves arise, and the internodes are that is the area between the two leaves. In a newly developing seedling, there are two growing points called apical meristems. Apical because they're at the end, and meristem because there's a bunch of dividing cells. They produce primary growth, growing up and growing down. The shoot apical meristem at the top, um, like the one in the root, is omnipotent. That it means the cells can grow and change into all sorts of different kinds of cells and tissues as they mature. As the cells in the meristematic region of the shoot apex divide and grow, they become specialized into the internal tissues of the stem. The apical meristem gives rise to four main tissues: the epidermis, the vascular system, the xylem and phloem, the pith, and the cortex. Here, the four main regions of the stem are shown. This is probably a test question too. The apical meristem is dividing at the top, becomes different specialized kinds of cells. The epidermis on the outside, the cortex storing sugars, the vascular system, which is the xylem and phloem, and the pith, which provides support for the stem. Growth of the stem occurs in several directions. Primary growth, up and down, is from the two apical meristems. Secondary growth is increasing the width of the stem and comes from an internal meristematic region called the vascular cambium. Let's take a look at that. If we take a cross section of the stem, you'll see an internal ring called the vascular cambium. The cells on the outside are phloem, and the cells on the inside are xylem. Phloem carrying the sugars, and xylem carrying the water. In this picture, you can see the smaller dividing cells dividing into becoming specialized xylem and phloem. This is the internal plumbing, which carries the water and nutrients around the plants and connects down to the roots as well. There are two basic arrangements of vascular tissue within the stems. For monocots, that's monocotyledonous plants, seedlings with one cotyledon, the primary vascular tissues are scattered throughout the cortex. In the dicotyledonous plants has two cotyledons in the seedling. The vascular tissue appears more or less continuous hollow cylinder, which divides the cortex and the pith. The outer region is called cortex, the inner region is called pith. And those dividing cells within create the xylem and phloem, the vascular plumbing system of the plant. Vascular cambium and the dicot will eventually merge and become that vascular ring we see in tree rings. The xylem internal to the ring and the phloem external to the ring. The pith on the inside provides support for the plant, which allows trees to grow much taller than monocots can. If anything cuts into the phloem of the stem, it can cut off the flow of sugar and eventually kills the plant. This is called girdling. It's a cut completely around the stem that cuts into the phloem. It can be done with a knife, but it also can be done with something like a chain of a bicycle if it's left there over time. There's yet one more internal cambium for a tree trunk, for example. It's called a cork cambium. It forms externally to the phloem and produces the familiar bark of trees. If we look at a cross section of a tree from the inside going out, you start with the heartwood. These are xylem cells that are full of gunk materials, waste products of metabolism, and they produce some of the great colors in the heartwood of mahogany and oaks, and the good color of wood. The lighter colored xylem is called sapwood. These are functional xylem cells that are carrying water up through the plant. Continuing to work outward from the xylem, the sapwood, which is an active area of the stem carrying water. You have a vascular cambium of dividing cells, very narrow. You can't see it here. Followed by the phloem on the outer part outside of the vascular cambium. Phloem is sometimes called inner bark. It's alive and transports sugars. Then you've got a cork cambium, again dividing cells that are dividing outwardly, producing an outer bark or the cork, a part of the tree. You might see this picture in an exam. The cork oak tree of the Mediterranean region is really good at producing bark. It can be harvested every 10 to 12 years to produce a cork used for wine bottles. It's important not to cut too deep, however. If you cut the outer bark, you're fine, but if you cut below the cork cambium and cut into the phloem, you can girdle the plant and kill it. The next time you look at a tree trunk, try to imagine the various regions beneath the surface. Tree trunks can get quite large. This one in Sunderland, Massachusetts is huge. If you're near UMass, go out to Route 116 towards Sunderland, turn north, that is right, on Route 47, and a few hundred yards up on the left, you'll find this huge sycamore tree. This tree is called a Constitution sycamore on Route 47 in Sunderland. It was a seedling when the American Constitution was signed. And of course, we know how old trees can be by taking a core out of them. You can count the rings. The so-called rings of the tree are formed because the xylem cells produced early in the spring of each year are larger than those produced later in the summer, generally. This produces a successive ring of larger and smaller cells. You can count the number of years the tree has been alive. Dendrochronology is a science of telling how old a tree is. You can count the rings in some trees relatively easy. They pull a core about a pencil size out of the tree and count it. Notice there that this tree was planted by a Native American in 1489, and in 1971, this is the birth year of the idiot who cut down the tree. Some trees can get really old. Here is Bob Leverett looking at a tree along the Mohawk Trail in western Massachusetts. Bob's identified hundreds of trees that are 300 years or more older in this region. Some trees along the Mohawk Trail in western Massachusetts can get over 350 years old. Bob's identified several old oaks that are that old. They're generally found on very, very steep slopes where farming wasn't done following the Civil War. Any place where sheep could have grazed, they probably where trees were cut down to graze the sheep. Some of those trees in western Massachusetts can get pretty tall as well. Here's the Jake's Swamp white pine. It's the tallest living thing in Massachusetts, 160 feet. Trees can grow in dense forests and they grow very, very slowly. They don't need to get very, very big, but they can be very, very old. Remember two types of growth? Primary growth is growing up and growing down from the apical meristems. Secondary growth is growing out wide, making the plant wider through the vascular and the cork cambiums. The various growth patterns of trees make woods of different color. Remember, this is all secondary growth in the dicotyledonous plant. The palm tree, like a corn plant and other monocots, does not produce secondary wood or secondary xylem. Palm tree, therefore, is not considered wood. If you cut it open, you'll find the vascular bundles scattered throughout the stem, not in a ring like an oak tree. If you happen to see this question on a test, remember the palm tree is not considered wood. The palm tree, like the corn plant, has its vascular bundles scattered throughout the stem. The monocot therefore remains flexible as it grows. The dicot on the right has the ability to produce secondary wood and produce much larger stems and more sturdy stems, as we see in the big trees in western Massachusetts. Of course, there's other economic stems. Bamboo. Bamboo can be grown here in Massachusetts. It's a slow growing type of northern bamboo. Asparagus is actually a stem that can be consumed. Kohlrabi, remember the kohlrabi plant? That's an expanded stem. And remember for sure, the Irish or common potato really is an underground stem. Well, we're used to thinking about bamboo in the tropics. Here's some bamboo growing in Massachusetts. It can make a really nice garden shrub. The part of the asparagus plant that we eat is actually a stem with a compact bud at the top. It's harvested when it's 6 to 8 inches tall. Once it gets taller, it gets really fibrous, as in this picture here. Here's some asparagus ferns in my garden. The leafy part of the fern produces sugars that are stored in the roots during the winter and reemerge in the spring as harvestable stems. I've never really liked kohlrabi, but it really is easy to grow. It's a swollen stem, and some people kind of like it. Remember, if you leave a potato in the sun, it'll turn green. Don't eat the green part because that's slightly toxic. Common potato, the Irish potato, is an underground stem. Probably a test question, too. Stems are stored up sunshine. And I think that's about enough for stems today.